I'm so excited to present this absolutely fascinating talk with Stephanie Bacon. Stephanie has been a teacher for more than 20 years, and in a moment of inspiration, she took a break from the classroom to get her doctorate. So now she's deep into a dissertation that will turn your mind over and over again regarding the beliefs you probably have regarding teachers' emotional preparation in facing the challenges of today's students. Stephanie shares her underlying belief of what education is for: to empower children and prepare them for the world around them, the erroneous focus we may have for students and teachers on a cognitive rather than an emotional foundation, and what her contribution may well be when she finishes her studies and goes back into the classroom. That will be revolutionary for everyone around her. I think you're going to be mesmerized by Stephanie's ability to encompass a myriad of educational factors in the learning environment, how we need to reconsider our beliefs about what we see in the classroom, and the transparent clarity of her observations of what's important and perhaps not so beneficial to our children coming from our politicians' choices and dictates. We're starting right in with our chat when we're clarifying what the focus will be in the interview. In essence, anything Stephanie feels called to talk about. We just want parents and teachers to have more information so teachers can be more informed outside of their own classes, and parents have more information about what the options are for their children, and everybody wants to know more. You agree?
I absolutely agree. And I think you've done an amazing job at kind of synthesizing the desires of all the stakeholders. Teachers want to know more, parents want to know more. Parents and teachers want to engage in new ways, make decisions with information that's relevant. And I think there's a lot of unsaid conversations or conversations that aren't well represented that can be really informative. So I totally appreciate you opening the conversation.
Well, I think you just opened the conversation so concisely and so beautifully. I think that we can just go on from there. So, Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about what your focus is in your dissertation?
I focused, originally I wanted to study like the emotional health and relational skills that teachers have. And I was just trying to put that idea together that like sometimes teachers, we don't really do that well relating to kids. And
interesting.
So in the research, though, I found it had been studied, and there's a group that wrote a large paper called The Pro-Social Classroom. And in that, they describe kind of a host of emotional and relational skills that they call social emotional competence.
Sure.
And competence is such a sticky word, right? It's like, do you have the skills? But I like it. It's edgy and it's important. So my research is focusing on how social emotional competence impacts teacher and student relationships, because we already know, the research already shows that teacher-student relationships are impactful on learning, and good relationships are connected with high learning outcomes, right? So I don't have to make that connection. The connection I want to make is that teachers come into the classroom with varying levels of social and emotional competence, and the profession itself actually has features that lower and degrade our social emotional competence, as it kind of challenges our ability to be authentic and puts us in situations where we make choices sometimes and do things that we know in our hearts and in our minds and what we've learned aren't the right choices.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So, for example, in a school that I worked at for about 10 years, there was a big push to increase literacy scores as measured on a computer dynamic test, right? The kids they get online, they get reading passages. If they get it right, it gets harder. If they get it wrong, it gets easier. And at the end of 30 minutes, the test shoots out a grade level equivalent reading score. So when I was teaching, there was a huge push to have those scores increase by certain amounts throughout the year, by the end of the year. And of course, we want students to grow in reading. But literacy is more than reading, right? So writing, this is just a literacy test. And often a lot of what it's measuring is vocabulary. So there were definitely times in my career where the pressure to report my scores, or we'd have a staff meeting and where another teacher's scores were highlighted. Oh, look what Miss Smith did with her scores. How are you going to change your scores? And so then I would do things like ask students to retake the test. Hey, why don't you come in and you can sit next to me at my desk and maybe that'll help you focus. And so that in my mind and in my heart, I knew the child had grown. I'd seen their writing change, or maybe their contributions in class had changed. But what I was saying to the student was, we've got to change this number because what you're doing right now isn't enough. And this is a very gentle example.
Okay.
But this is happening over and over and over again in classrooms across the US, where we have a huge testing and accountability process.
And I hear more and more of that. This is really fascinating, Stephanie, because I'm not sure how much you want to go into your dissertation, but it has so much to do with your focus on teaching. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what really matters. Yeah.
Because part of it is what I want parents to understand is that teachers are really authentic, or they want to be authentic, and in general. And the administration, the government is, when the government and the administration get involved, it compromises our integrity. And we have to decide at some point whether we're going to keep our jobs or make big decisions that have to do with the integrity of our students as well. Is that sort of close to what you're studying?
Absolutely. I did a little bit of research before shifting on decision-making of teachers. And what we know is teachers literally make thousands of decisions in a week, hundreds of really important decisions in a day. And there's a real phenomenon called decision fatigue, where the quality of our decisions declines because there's so many different decisions to make, where we're being asked to integrate so many different factors. And a lot of those factors are external factors. And these are decisions that are being made by administrators, being made by school boards, being made by state legislatures that are really distant from the classroom. And of course, well-intended, but there's such a breach from what we know is happening in the classroom and the decision makers. And that breach of reality makes for a tension that I believe is pretty unproductive if we go back to what is the purpose of schooling, which is, I think, what you also want to talk about. What are we trying to do with students when they walk in the door and when they walk out the door?
Thank you, because I love the question, because I love the answer, but we sort of started in the middle. So what I'd love to do is just go back a little bit and tell me your experience in education. What is your history?
My mother was an educator. So I feel like I've been thinking about education for 30 years. And what my mom and I would do was, if we were in a long car ride, she would be talking about what's going on in the classroom. And she'd be speaking about, kids that were close to my age or some of my friends. And we'd really be problem solving, what went wrong with a lesson or what went right with a lesson, or how students were receiving lessons, and what, again, was the goal. And both my parents have been pretty politically active, and we always saw the goal of education as education is to empower people, right? It's to give them what they need to go into society and fulfill their dreams and also be productive members of society. I mean, this planet, it requires all of us to be working together. So whenever I'd be talking with my mother, we would be going way into what is the purpose of education? And watching kids learn is something that I learned when I was an outdoor educator. So I went to college like all the other kids. I didn't know what I wanted to be, but I had the opportunity to go into the outdoors and facilitate small lessons with students on a trail, for example, looking at how trees decompose and how they create other environments. And what I recognize is there's so much energy in learning. And as you know, as we've learned, energy is resonant. So I chose to go back and get my teaching credential. My bachelor's degree is in environmental studies and planning. And from there, I dove right into the classroom. And what's interesting, my first lessons were so authentic. Those first students, I was 23 years old, and I was so excited to be teaching language arts and social studies. And my first lessons were essentially, we are going to create a newsletter and publish our learning each week, right? Because I needed to teach reading and writing. And I also wanted to communicate with families. And I wanted to include all the kids in the process and have everybody writing with authentic, real purposes. Well, that newsletter lasted about 2 years until we were asked to link all of our lessons to standards, to integrate a new curriculum that we had gotten, that was like a teacher's manual that was this thick with 10 books for each student for language arts.
Yeah. And
trying to manage this adopted curriculum, I couldn't manage the newsletter. It was enough to be supporting kids writing about their authentic learning each week and kind of navigating how do I teach some writing skills within this kind of free form context, which I was doing, but adding on the layer of this literature anthology with the grammar practice workbooks, it was something I couldn't manage. So out went the authentic, and in went the scripted language arts program. And from that experience, it made me sad and a little bit disenchanted with the work. So I went back to school to get my master's degree, knowing that I loved education. And I got my master's degree in literacy because I'd also gotten a reading specialist credential from the University of California at Berkeley. And I just wanted to extend that. And at that point, I was thinking, this is too much for me, the whole class. Maybe I'll be a reading specialist. And through that process, I actually developed a curriculum where I had been trained to be a reading coach myself. And then, of course, budget cuts, our district cut all their reading coaches. So I wasn't going to get that position. So I took all my lessons that I had done as a reading coach to get that certification, and I made them student friendly. And when I teach language arts to this day, I teach a program called Reading Coaches, where I teach students how our brain reads, and I teach them how to prompt and support each other's reading process. And I open the classroom to a place where we make mistakes and we learn together. And I do very short intervals where kids read out loud and discuss their reading with reading coach prompts. And that's been a tremendous success. It's definitely a lot of work, but in the end, I've empowered the students to do what I couldn't do as a teacher. When you have 30 students, I couldn't apply like that one-to-one model. And then more recently in my career, I just got to a point where I was like, I need more energy in my profession, right? So I decided to go back to school again and start a doctoral program, hoping that might lead me into maybe some kind of professorship. But what I learned is a tenure track professor starts young and works for free for a lot of years. And so learning that, I still enjoyed the learning, and I was like, I'm not ready to go back and work for free. So I'm still going to continue this learning process. And then had some personal things happen in my life where stress in my human life impacted my classroom work. And at the time I was working with a professional life coach, and she helped me kind of reconnect with my emotions, disconnect from the need to achieve and have the best test scores and the cleanest house all at the same time. And so much of what she taught me changed the way I showed up in the classroom. I came with more compassion. I came more ready to receive the children where they were instead of thinking about where they had to be in that huge gap. I came as my real self. I cried in front of my students on a day where they were taking away my ability to attend classes at the university because of a district rule. And what I got back from my students was amazing. They were so cooperative. They started to solve their own problems, right? Because we would just be witness to problems and not traumatized by them and just say, instead of me pretending I knew the answer to the problem, I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't know what to do about what happened on the playground. That sounds really hard. I stopped pretending to know. The kids stepped up with their knowing and with their hearts and with their authenticity. And my classroom was transformed. So
how old were your students at this point?
They're fifth graders. So they're 10, okay. They turn 11. And at that point, up to that point, I was looking at political influences on teacher decision-making. And when I had that personal experience with, the changes in me impacting the changes in the students, I shifted my research over to social and emotional competence.
Why did you switch it? Because the political influence seems to be almost parallel to what the administrative influences are. Am I right?
Well, in the United States right now, the political influences are extreme and they vary so much state by state that it's really hard to study. And that's not necessarily why I changed, but I changed mostly because I decided to follow my own passion. But in the United States, you really would have to regionalize your research. A teacher in California is going to have so many different kind of, one, policies to work under, but two, just social pressures, and even just different regions in California. So the political divide in the United States is so extreme and so dynamic. I mean, laws are changing daily that limit or empower teachers with what they can or cannot say. So talk about a blow to authenticity, everybody's authenticity. And that's just the thing. These policymakers think, oh, we're going to make this policy to control the teacher because we don't want the teacher, like I believe Florida has some law about you can't say gay. So we're going to take that word away without recognizing what that does to the students. It's like, so the policy control is what they're thinking about. We're going to prevent this problem, but it just creates another.
Well, it's the same thing as saying, you can't wear something because it might be too attractive instead of teaching people how to control their urges, we could say, right? In other words, the government might be looking in the wrong place to put a structure around the classroom. And I do have a question then, if there's such pressure, I'm not as familiar. I was a teacher in New Mexico, and I'm not as familiar with the policies in California. I would assume that they're more liberal than most of the country. I don't know if that's true or not. But what I'm wondering is, what kind of support do you get from the parents if you sort of veer from the established curriculum?
Yeah, so in California, there's a couple things that protect teachers. One, there's a strong protection of unions. So teachers in California know that they're going to have legal support if they're acting, within the confines of the California law. The other protection that, teachers in California have is, in general, the state legislature and state government is liberal. But California geographically is broken up into districts, school districts, some of which are in conservative areas. And the new movement is that school boards are taking so much more power over classroom life than in previous generations. So currently, let me start with the old model of a school board was the superintendent works with their cabinet and their school principals to kind of develop courses of action for the district. And the school board is there to kind of, most of the time, rubber stamp what these trained professionals have been working on, right? And of course, school boards are there to help us kind of maintain some integrity with how we use our budgets and other roles. But now there's a movement in the United States where parents with very specific goals for a school run for school board. And then because they have some oversight into hiring and firing, then exert this power over site administrators, over superintendents about how schools are run. And so in California, I have a dear friend that literally is only 90 minutes away. And even though the school itself is in probably a pretty evenly politically, populated space, a group of highly motivated and unified conservative parents uprooted the existing school board, got themselves elected, and during the pandemic, forced policy changes to get their kids back in school despite CDC recommendations. And again, this is all in California. And then just multiply that by the entire United States. It's so messy.
I know. And I had an experience in Spain where when I first came, I worked for a school. It's called the American School, and there are American schools all over the world. This particular one was run by the parents. It was owned by the parents. So it's very similar to what you're talking about. They are not specialists in education. They simply have a lot of money, and they wanted to have the power to make decisions. And it was to the detriment of the school and the detriment of their children. And in my case, I lasted 5 years. And looking back on it, I don't know how I lasted those 5 years. But the 5th year, I finally decided to leave because I was an English literature teacher. And you probably know that English literature, I was very conscientious. I read every single essay. I mean, every single one. And I gave a lot of essays and writing to my students. And there was one student who just never did the work. But not just in my class. He failed 7 classes out of 8. And because the parents ran the school, they passed him. They let him go on. And I said, you know what? I'm doing my job so conscientiously for absolutely no reason, it seems. And I just had to back away. And I actually did go back to school and got my doctorate. That was my excuse for leaving, but I would have left anyway. There's an imbalance where I understand the parents want to be involved and they need to be involved, but not to the extent where they're making decisions if they don't understand the ramifications. And I think that's what you're saying as well.
Absolutely. And what you describe is so important for us to highlight. And that is when you are doing your best to do what you've been trained to do, and it is undermined by a decision like you mentioned, or it's undermined by, hey, you've got to use this curriculum that we just bought for $1 million. The teacher has to go to a place of, I care less.
Exactly.
I can't care because it hurts too bad to be passionate about what I do and then be told to do something different. And that experience on loop leads to teachers who you have no cares to give anymore. And I think many teachers do a wonderful job showing up and just caring about the student. But that enthusiasm that you bring to the classroom where, you're awarding students who've worked really hard on their essays and they're passing, and it's so meaningful because they've shown that growth and worked hard for that. But the same student is getting the pass, it just takes your enthusiasm out. And what we know about the brain is enthusiasm is what lights us up, and we just keep turning it off. And what people don't realize is, they think, I'll just turn it off for the teachers. They'll be fine. And then we show up with our negative energy, our overwhelm, I just don't care that much. And what do our students do? They give it right back to us. They either give it back to us in anxiety. If the teacher shows up with anxiety, they give it back to us. I just don't care that much.
And that's actually, Stephanie, that's actually exactly what happened to me. I cannot work somewhere where I don't care. I can't get out of bed if I don't care about something. And when this happened, it's just what you're saying. It happened in the middle of the year. And all of a sudden I said, you know what? There's no reason for me to putting so much energy sincere energy into correcting these kids' work and trying to ask them to put their energy into work and trying to improve if it doesn't matter in the end. And the students said to me, they said, when I told them I was leaving at the end of the year, they said, was this around February? Because all of a sudden you gave us all A's. Yes. And I thought, this is exactly why we should not be in the classroom if we don't care. We need to back off, which is what I did, but I had to stay for 3 more months. And as you're saying, I cared about them. I stopped caring about the work, and it's not a place to be for a teacher not to care about his or her work. So
Yeah.
I would love to go back to what your dissertation is about, the affective domain, about the emotional aspect of teachers in the classroom and their effect on the students and the students on the teacher. Would you extend a little bit of what your work is there?
Sure. So one thing that I noticed in doing the research is many of our learning theories about how kids learn evolved as technology evolved, as our way of learning evolved, right? So at first, we look at people learning from like conditioned responses and memorization and incremental. It's like, give them the list of words and they practice the words and then they say the words and they feel good about it. And then they move on to the next level. And we see that as learning. And then later, we started to be able to do brain scans and more sophisticated observations of children in contexts. And learning theories noted that learning doesn't, no matter what you do, it doesn't occur at the same rate for all kids, right? And so we have to look at what creates the change. What's the learner themselves? And so learning theories started to look at what does the learner brain? And then at the same time, we're able to scan the brain and we get some information about, okay, let's look at the brain and let's look at what fires up. And we can see that some students have brains that fire more often and that fire when they're more active or less active, right? So for so much time, we looked at learning as cognitive and behavioral. And now we've had to, in more modern, and I would say maybe in the last 20 to 30 years, we've recognized that even when we looked at cognitive and behavioral differences in learners and how they learn, there's still more differences to figure out, right? So then there's like a sociocultural lens added, and so we start looking at how different groups of people learn and how does poverty affect learning, right? And we've looked at poverty in terms of the brain. So we've scanned brains of children in poverty, and we've looked at how poverty influences decision-making cognitively. But the next step is emotional. And there's a theory, I want to say it came out in 1998 by Hargraves, and he talks about the emotional nature of learning.
Are we talking about the limbic system? When you're talking about the brain scans, just to go back a little bit, when we're talking about brain scans, you're talking about some students light up more, but it's also showing different parts of the brain light up. And Am I right in saying that the limbic system is really the sort of toll booth? If the limbic system is not geared down, the information won't go into the brain and you won't see that light lit up activity in the cerebral problem.
So I would be totally like out of my range. I literally have to have a map of the brain when we talk about the brain to remember. But from my understanding, a lot of what we looked at was cognitive connections and how we think to learn instead of how we feel to learn. Okay. And yes, those brain scans can expose emotional centers in the brain, but it's something that hasn't been jumped on in terms of research until, there's a body of research within the last 30 years, but you know how fast research makes it to the classroom, very slowly. Right. So, and I think if you were to just go out into the streets and say, how do people learn? Very few people are going to say it's an emotional event, right? People think of learning as a cognitive act. And so then in recent times, we've looked at, oh, wait, it's not a cognitive act. And we've developed social emotional learning for students. So in the United States, I would say 10 years ago, most school districts adopted a social emotional learning for student program, right? And who's going to give those programs? Who's going to do the social emotional learning lesson with the kids? The teacher, right?
Sure.
But studying the social and emotional capacity of the teacher hasn't really happened very broadly. So you're saying to a human, teach something. I don't know if you're good at it at all. Go ahead and teach it. And we wouldn't do that in math. We wouldn't do it in science. Go ahead and teach, calculus, Stephanie. I don't know if you're good at it, but I got this book for you to follow. In the United States, we have to pass certain tests to teach certain subjects, right? It's the assumption. My research focuses on the assumption that teachers are socially and emotionally competent, that we have the skills to relate to students, to interpret their behavior appropriately, to take responsibility for our own behavior in ways that foster good relationships. And what I would argue is that assumption is false. No matter one, I would say people show up to the classroom as teachers at various levels of competence. I know, for example, I came in as a perfectionist. I wasn't going to take the blame. I worked so hard to have everything perfect that if something went wrong in the classroom, I spent a lot of time blaming the student. Even though I had a good life in a small town, there were some skills that I didn't really have. And we think, because it's hard to talk about, when we throw our children into classroom for a good percentage of their day, 1/3 of the day, we want to believe that we're sending them with people who have really good relational skills and really good self-awareness. But that's an assumption. And the other problem is that, like you mentioned, the site administrators, the school district administrators, the state legislature, all put these pressures on teachers that make them shape-shift into humans that they really aren't, which further separates them from any kind of social or emotional help, because they have to care less. They have to act like learning isn't emotional, or they lose their emotionality from teaching and learning altogether because they've been so disenfranchised from making decisions that they actually believe in.
So I'm wondering, Stephanie, if you don't mind, your research is showing how the assumption is erroneous. And I mean, it's literally because we are human, and we enter a classroom with smaller human, usually smaller. What I'm wondering is if you're going to give some proposals at the end that might reflect some solutions to this, because you say when you went into teaching, you were a perfectionist. When I went into teaching, I was pretty emotionally naive. I think what happened was I learned to be very reflective, but I had to admit to myself that I had things to learn. I had to give myself the space to do that. And I had to consciously reflect every day on how I could improve. If it worked, what did I do well? If it didn't work, what could I change the next day? And so the reflection, I always tell teachers reflection is our most important tool. And I'm just
100%.
wondering if it's something I also teach students. And you just use the word teach, and I usually don't use the word teach. I usually use the word co-learning, co-creating, because we are in the classroom to collaborate, not to just be dictators. So I'm wondering if in your research, reflection or proposals on how to sort of combat this huge assumption that teachers go in ready and complete, because it's just not the truth. And also, if I can just add a little bit more to that, because unfortunately, teaching has a stigma that you become a teacher and you can accept whatever pay the state decides to give you. You have very young teachers going in who may or may not continue after 3 or 4 years. So you get more new teachers, and you have, I'm not sure what the percentage is now, but we don't have the longevity that we used to have, because the kids today just aren't going to accept the pay that the states pay teachers.
Accept the pay and the working conditions, the stresses, the new students who are showing up in our classroom. So I have one question for you. You highlighted a really important process for teachers, and that's reflection. In any of the school contexts that you worked in, did you have reflection time provided, held sacred by your schedule?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's a fascinating question, because wouldn't that be valuable? But do you know of any school that has that?
I don't know of any school. I do think there are some exist, because I have talked with some people with some way out of the box, some private schools where it's like heart-centered school, right? So I believe that those schools exist, but they don't exist for students who can't afford private school, which means students who can't afford private school are then again getting a lesser schooling a lot of time. It's not always true. But so then to come back to your question in terms of I've identified a problem and what's the remedy? I just want to take a quick minute to go into the details of the problem. So social emotional competence is really made up of 3 things. One is self-awareness, and it's self-awareness in really 2 frames. Am I aware of my own emotions Am I aware of my own motivations? Am I aware of my own strengths and weaknesses, right? So showing up in an awareness of strength and weakness we're not going to hide. I'm not going to hide my strengths and I'm not going to hide my weak. That's social emotional competence. Then there's other awareness. And that is, can you interpret the emotions of others appropriately? That's one part of it.
Interpersonal relationship, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
And then the other part is, can you allow yourself to be culturally sensitive and also culturally aware enough to uphold cultures that are different from your own, right? And really celebrate those in ways that allow those students to be able to feel valued in the classroom. But coming back to the awareness of other emotions, there's a term called spurious emotionality that occurs in classrooms, and I think it's really frequent. It's when you misinterpret the emotions of a student in a way that then causes a cycle of kind of, you're doing the wrong thing to fix it. So think about the student who's defiant, right? And there's many ways to defiant, the kid is like, I'm not passing these papers back. I'm not doing anything today. I'm not going to stop talking to my friend. And it's so easy as a teacher to interpret that as, the kid's just a jerk. His parents don't have any boundaries at home. He's having a bad day. I'm going to ignore, or I'm going to take this personally. And I'm going to be like, oh, he doesn't like my class. Kind of some self-degradation. When really that child may have found out, in the morning that their parents are getting divorced, or maybe his best friend right before class, betrayed him, right? And so we tend to not often have the time to engage with students and say, hey, what's going on? Or, for the past few days, you haven't been doing much work. And then again, if we're not self-aware, we haven't been modeling our own awareness to students. Oh gosh, I showed up today. I just got this horrible message from my friend. It hurt my feelings and I'm just not myself, right? So we're not exposing our own true awareness. And then we are assuming where behavior is coming from. And in that moment, that child may just need some compassion to flip the switch. And instead, very often we get punitive. Okay, well, you're going to have to stay in at lunch. You're going to have to stay here until you get that done. Or you need to sit in that other desk. So the child could be already feeling isolated and betrayed. And we're going to double down it by saying, now you may move away from everyone. Please get out of my zone, right? And what we're trying to do, there's no bad intent. You're trying to preserve the learning environment for the rest of the kids. Are like, I'm ready to go. I want to do it. But with increased in social emotional competence, you're going to be able to say, hey, I want to come back to you in a few minutes. Let's talk more about this. Let's make a plan that works for both of us. And some kind of compassionate move. And so that aspect of self and other awareness is really important and kind of reciprocal. Oh, I'm aware of when I have a bad day and shut down. And what do I need? I need compassion. And so I'm just going to guess. I'm going to start with compassion first. And then the last part of social emotional competence is being aware of decision impact and really getting into the nitty gritty of how is my decision going to impact the other? So my example, when I said I would frequently ask kids who needed to change their score to retake the test, an aware teacher, and this took me a long time to develop, would go, I'm thinking I want to make them retake the test because my administrator's asking me to raise the scores. But I know that decision is going to make them feel like they haven't done enough, that they haven't learned enough, that I don't see all their other efforts. And in order to have that kind of decision impact awareness, I need time to think. And that goes back to your point about reflection. So I need time to think, and I need time. The other decision impact awareness you can do in both of those situations with the child who's acting out, and let's say you do send them to the corner, you can also walk over there and say, I realize I just made a decision that might not have helped you. I just further isolated you. I want to try again. And that is the social emotional competence of being able to take responsibility. I could go back to those kids. I'm so sorry I made you take that test again. Let's look at all the ways you've shown me your reading has improved. And I'm just going to go up and stand up to my administrator and say, test scores are what they are. If you need other evidence that this kid has learned and improved in their reading, let me know.
So Stephanie, there's the problem, is that you have come to the conclusion and knew intuitively that emotional competences are critical. And I've spoken with so many teachers who, if they are emotionally mature, and if they've been in the classroom long enough to recognize that the look on their students' faces is much more important than the marks that they get later, they will admit that emotions are the top priority. So if the schools now are evaluating the teacher by checking off the boxes, by checking off the curricular points, most teachers don't feel they have literally the time to be able to devote to being compassionate and trying to evaluate the emotions. Competences are huge here, by the way. You're saying that competence, as you said earlier, that competence is sort of a sophisticated word. Here, competence is used frequently because it's sort of what the European Union wants the teachers now to work on. But it is not comfortable for teachers here. They're used to having to check off the boxes. There are inspectors that come into the classroom here. And if you're not doing exactly what the curriculum says you're supposed to be doing, you get marked off. And so these emotional competences are critical, or we don't feel comfortable and our students don't learn. And yet the administrators most often don't give us the support to slow down and get down to be able to relate to our students exactly the way you're suggesting is what we need to do for their benefit.
Yeah. So what's it going to take to help our leaders recognize that what they're creating with their checklists is separating, and this goes way back to Marxist theory, the subject from the object. You are absolutely separating people from their reality and saying, what you have to learn can be checked off on a box. And that again goes back to those administrators' needs to check their own boxes and really to release themselves of their stresses. And it then goes back to their checking those boxes because of the government agencies that are asking them to demonstrate competencies, right? And that goes back to our government entities not recognizing, not fully understanding learning theory, not understanding how important emotion is, because they're not taking the time. So when you talked about the remedies, right? The remedy to, how do we build social emotional competence and how do we awaken our leaders to this? Is that we really have to give people that space to become more self-aware, not just teachers. What I would argue is, in terms of social and emotional competence, the administrators don't have it either. And our government officials don't have it either. And their jobs aren't making it any easier to develop. So here we have a system inhabited and controlled by humans who aren't taking time to think about decision impact, who aren't taking time to be self-aware and know where their motivations come from. I had a brief stint as a union president, and I would go down and meet with members of the California legislature. And I remember when I was talking to them, I was like, wow, what caring and wonderful people. And then I'd look at their legislation and I'd be like, whoa, ouch, what are you doing? And though I think in our attempts to become these great competitive societies where we're winning all the races, we lose our authenticity. And I believe when I did speak to those politicians, I was getting a taste of their authenticity and I loved it. Them saying, I really care about kids. And I remember going to school and I remember having outdoor education experiences and that influenced my life in this way, right? And we're talking to this human. And then humans are going into the workplace and losing their authenticity and exchanging it for a competitive edge.
So here's the question for you. You're still a fifth grade teacher at this point, yes?
I actually took a leave from my fifth grade position last year, and to work on my doctorate and have a few kind of life twists and turns. I took a brief stint to make money in like the private sector, and boy, did that make me miss education. But I'll go back to the classroom in the fall. I don't know what grade level I'll be assigned to teach, so that'll be exciting. I am hoping to teach middle school. I've done it in the past, and our middle schoolers in the town that I live in are having a really hard time. The school itself is being challenged with behaviors that it hasn't seen before. And the students have been engaging in trying to get teachers fired. And so I'm really curious about what is going on in those schools and for those students, that's how they're using their power. So I hope to go back to middle school.
Okay, so I usually, and toward the end of the interview, I ask a what if question because I find it's the most fascinating. If you could, what would you do in a perfect world, an ideal world? What would you do with your dissertation if you could have more influence on the policies in your school when you go back?
I love that question. I think that because policy has such a dramatic impact on classroom life, meaning what the policymakers do, I'd really like to be facilitating authenticity work with our leaders. And that could be at the state level, at the local level. But definitely, I would like to empower our leaders with reconnecting themselves with their purpose, with their imperfect humanness, to help them instead of standing up for everything that's going to give us a competitive edge. We have to stop competing. The problems that our world faces today are global. It's not going to matter if the US is better than the UK. What's going to matter is, can we work together to solve, for example, a problem in the ocean? That's not national, it's global. And so I would love to just do work where we kind of recognize the fun and the inspiration that competition can give us, the energy, but also the need to really step back into our humanity and away from our quest for external power and come back to the internal power, because I feel like we're really going to have to engage the whole body, mind, heart, soul to address the problems that face us right now.
So it sounds like the same methods that you would love to use or ideally use for the administrators could be used on the students who are inappropriately trying to put themselves in the position of making decisions that they really are not educated enough. And I know I'm using this word with a little bit of a twist. They're not educated enough to make.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for me. Most of my learnings throughout my life, if I learned it and it was good for me, I would apply it and use it with my students. I'll start there, but for a broader impact, I'm going to keep going. Because, students are better at being students than adults. Kids will, they'll jump on that box with me and say, oh gosh, you're right. We're humans. How can we use our power to make things better? Kids are easy.
Especially if they see a model like you are being now, so authentic, and the fact that, you were being emotional in front of them and they stepped up. So if they have the model, they learn more profoundly. So right. Stephanie, I mean, there are such gems that you've given us today, just gems. And what I'd love to do is in 6 months or a year to revisit and see how you're doing. If the dissertation is finished and you've been able to bring some of your research into the schools and how you've affected people simply by existing in the school and working the way you feel is authentic. That's what's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to do that. I absolutely would love to do that. And I just, out of curiosity, if you have a moment, like so you're doing this podcast, but then last week you were traveling for your regular job, or So what are you
when I
working on?
do, I'm a teacher trainer, which I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher first and foremost. I think as a teacher, I try to do things that respect the classroom. I have the great good fortune, because it's not usual in Spain. I work for publishers and for different school systems to be able to go into the classroom. So what I love to do most is I give a workshop and then I'll go into the classroom, and I'll give another workshop and go back into the classroom. And usually there's a series of 3 times. Because you know this as well as anyone, we can take hundreds of workshops, but unless someone is there watching us, if we have a sort of obligation to make changes, we're not going to change a thing, even if we want to. So I go into the classroom and I either co-teach with them, or I will have given them some suggestions beforehand. And I'm there to just support. I mean, they see me as an evaluator. And in a sense, I mean, that's true. But what I'm really there to do is emotionally push them forward. I want them to, like you're saying, focus on competences more than content. And it's not easy because, like many countries, Spain is really entrenched in tradition. And teachers are taught from a very young age that talking is how you learn. And that's just not true. There's some people who learn when they listen to something. I'm not one of them. And we could say maybe 75% of students in the classroom don't learn by listening. And yet teachers here talk all day long.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. I mean, from preschool to university. So what I do is I go in and just try to help them very slowly, unfortunately, change their methodology. And I love it. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
We've done a lot of work in our district to get kids talking. We actually do. We call them constructive conversations, and we have lesson after lesson. And so I would say that's one of the things we've done. We've done well, though not every teacher does it, and we don't have anyone coming around to check.
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, it's controversial. I think in the States we're more used to people coming into the classroom. In Spain, it's not usual at all. Even the parents are not really allowed to be in the classroom. So my going in makes them very nervous. And I'm learning. I've learned to be much more compassionate, and that helps them.
And so ends, for the moment, an absolutely fascinating conversation with Stephanie Bacon. Her dissertation is going to have far-reaching influences, not only in her own life, but that of her students, and hopefully in many districts around her. We need to stop assuming that teachers walk into the classroom ready for all of the challenges they face. And instead, we need to give them the education to deal with the socio-cultural elements that are becoming prevalent in schools today, so that they can be even more effective with our students and children. And hopefully we'll have another conversation with Stephanie soon. In the meantime, I'll see you here for more incredibly informative conversations at Doodles with Donna. You can send me comments and questions at donna@scaffoldingmagic.com, and find free activities for all methodologies at scaffoldingmagic.com. So have fun in your classes and at home, and I'll see you soon.